Thank you so much. So I've finished the formal part of my questions, and we have time for questions from you folks as well. So does anybody have a burning question? Tamara will bring the mic over.
Oh, it is working. I could start off with the first question. Well, actually, maybe a two-part question. Access to finance. It still is a bit of a barrier, is it not? Access to finance for a number of reasons. And I know we have in Canada this amazing Aboriginal network of Aboriginal financial institutions. There are around 50 of them across Canada. And they've been totally successful, and yet it's just not enough because the businesses are getting, as you described, Carol Anne, bigger and bigger and bigger. And so could you remark maybe on access to finance and the role of government in supporting that, and how to scale up those initiatives?
So I think that's a great question. I think part of the problem is that it's set up as a government program. So the Indigenous economy first needs to exist outside of government programs and services. That network of Aboriginal financial institutions are highly functioning, highly successful. They're deploying capital at a remarkable rate, but still the size and scale of the growth of Indigenous businesses is outpacing the programs itself. First of all, the program amounts was capped way on early, I think, in the Harper government. So the level of capital has stayed the same, but the growth of Indigenous business has escalated. So there's this huge gap in there. So I think that I referred to that concept earlier of that problem lens that we see. We need the narrative to shift towards seeing that as a capitalization, as the opportunity that's probably one of the biggest opportunities right now in the development of this country, to have Indigenous inclusion, the capitalization, and the alignment of this scale and pace of Indigenous business to be met with that ability to access capital. In my work, I can sometimes come across as sounding impatient, because to be able to see outside of the experience of that as a problem, that concept that Indigenous growth needs to be designed, Indigenous growth needs to exist outside of government programs and services, that's an opportunity in terms of building the structural response to the capitalization of the Indigenous economy.
Do we have any other questions here? Oh.
Okay. So hi. So my name is Camille. I'm from the unceded territory of the Mohawks in Quebec. And I'm presently doing a grad certificate in Indigenous nationhood. And I'm curious, I'm doing some legal research now. I have a background in law and working with the WSANISH right now in the Indigenous legal principle revitalizations. And I'm just curious to, I've heard you talk a lot about principles such as ownership and power plays, and I'm just curious to have your thoughts on turning away a bit more from the colonial system, because I think the reality also being here also with public administration is very embedded into the colonial system. So I'm just curious to hear you say, like, of how you perceive the ways Indigenous economies could be seen as with their own values and not be embedded into the colonial system. Because we talk a lot about capitalists and the 1 billion economy, and I just think those are kind of reflection of the colonial system we're faced with, and I understand that it's the reality and we have to still take a seat in that, but I mean, do you think it would be possible also to come out and turn away from the colonial system in that sense? And so yeah, just your thoughts on that.
I like this quote by a spiritual leader, Oren Lyons, from the Iroquois tradition, and he speaks of the experience of the onslaught of colonialism. And in the quote, he says, "You've been trying to teach us to be capitalists ever since you've got here, but you failed simply because we don't value what you value." And I think that we can construe or see that Indigenous business is about money. Indigenous business is about presence. Indigenous business is about resilience. Indigenous business is about our space in our own modernity. It's about we can be successful on our terms with our values. And I think there's often times that we see this pressure. If we come back to that concept of the economic table, we have nations in very real experience that are coming to the table hungry. We have that experience, and to be able to name that and realize that as a driver and as a motivation, that from that hierarchical needs perspective, to be able to understand, I referred to this concept, we live in a modern financial structure. Every single nation has a federal transfer agreement. So does every municipality. When we understand the experience of the federal transfer as embedded not within the Constitution, but the rights of Indigenous peoples to be recognized include the fiscal relationship. The fiscal equation of this country doesn't make sense. We have a federal budget that focuses on 98% social, health, education, and 2% economic development. To understand the expression of that and the realization of that in a colonial manner, to return to how do we look after each other? How do we look after the land? How do we look after place? Nations are responding in a structural way at the governance tables, trying to juggle that not enoughness, the deficit, the ability to create opportunity in spaces that have been denied. The pressures or drivers of what we would call market entry in a business perspective is entirely different from an Indigenous perspective. So to juggle traditional values, long-term generational decision-making, a deficit approach, barriers in language, and challenges, I think the sheer magic of the success of Indigenous business is a testament to resilience more than it is about engaging within a colonial system. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your words so far. I was just curious about the examples you had in mind for those billion-dollar success stories, and I was wondering about what the financing pathways were, to pick up on Tamara's question earlier. Was that mostly was that self-financing from other Indigenous financial entities, or was there government involvement in financing at some point? I was just wondering what that looks like. I realize there could be several different pathways.
I think there's a lot of different pathways in that. There was a story I heard out of Alberta that a major corporation that was moving towards partnership with a number of nations in the energy sector had essentially, the government didn't have the supportive structural capital pathways to make it happen. The company definitely did, and I think to come to the seat at the commercial bank was insufficient to have the capital response to the need of the size of that scale of business. And the company itself pushed within the bond markets to make that happen and really went out to bat for managing risk, managing partnership, and managing outcomes. And I think it's those early leaders that believe in economic prosperity that are building new networks, new partnerships, and new investment opportunities for nations at that level.
Hi, Carol Anne. So I read your book a couple times, and I'm familiar with the 7 generations approach and the connection to land. I guess I'm wondering what your opinion would be on, or your thoughts would be on, reconciling economic development with the urgent need for climate action, and what does Indigenous leadership look like in coming to a solution?
It's a great question. I think that we look at examples like the Great Bear Rainforest, which is a cross interest collaboration and network with Indigenous-led economic development, I think there's very strong indication that with the focus of investment into stewardship, guardianship, the intention is stronger results for climate management over the long term from an Indigenous perspective. I think that work is, the story of that is unfolding in real time in terms of Indigenous-led stewardship, resource management. We look at new even examples around Indigenous-led fire management systems, all of those aspects that Indigenous knowledge that's 10,000 years old is really being brought into focus in new ways. And I think that alignment between stewardship, resource management, risk management, and economic development, there's examples like the Great Bear Rainforest where those are aligned in very clear ways. And I think there's this definite vision of seeing Indigenous-led leadership in terms of climate results.
Do we have any more questions? Can I ask a final question? Okay, Carol Anne, you've been talking to so many people. I see, because I follow you on LinkedIn, I see you've been talking to CEOs, major corporations, heads of state probably, lots of government people. There's tons of interest, I think, right now. I can gauge that. And I just wondered, at those conversations, like what are they, particularly in conversations with government leadership, what are they asking of you and are most interested in, and what do they want to learn the most? What are the pressing questions?
That is a great question. I think it's funny because oftentimes the least liked question I like is, what opposition have you experienced against the idea of against Indigenomics? And I get asked that question so many times. I was like, that's your question? But I think in what you're asking, there's definitely a commonality. There's centering current understanding of the Indigenous relationship, asking kind of what do we need to pay attention to, and really fundamental to that is, what do we do? What's next? What does this look like? How do we move forward? I think that's the commonality of, yes, I do a lot of talking.
Well, thank you so much, so very much for coming and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. It's so good to see you again. I hope it's not as long next time. Thank you to our audience for coming and joining us in this dialogue. Really wonderful for you all to have made it here. And thanks again to Tamara for organizing, for our wonderful media folks who provided this great space. And I see Carmen is gone. I wish you all a wonderful evening, and we will see everybody again soon.